Okay.
It's over there. Great. Okay.
So what happens now, Matthew?
He says, glass of wine, looks into camera. And
a small glass.
We shall begin. Welcome, ladies and gents. Welcome one and all to the Salmon and Trout Conservation UK's first Untangled talk. And I'm rather hoping more of these shall follow in the weeks to months to come. And not just really untangling personalities like tonight's guest, but also untangling or at least attempting to de-bird's nest such controversies as salmon farming, maybe the reintroduction of beavers, a subject that I fear that is probably as likely to lead to sort of angry standoffs as discussing the pros and cons of Brexit. Now, the bidding for this evening, at least as far as the Salmon and Trout Conservation UK's website goes, mentions that our talk could be enjoyed with a glass of wine or whatever to hand. This remark wasn't intended to sort of further your lockdown excesses, truly. Instead, I was rather hoping it would serve as a signpost, really, that our untangled conversation should be enjoyed in a spirit of conviviality and of friendship and always of respect. We might not always agree with our speakers, but we should strive, I think, for mutual understanding wherever possible. One last thing before we crack on, apart from chosen a rather nice Pinot this evening. Before I introduce our guest, one of the many people watching this evening, a chap called Tony Mayer, who many of you will know, had the unenviable task of delivering some rather bad news over the last few days concerning the passing of a rather fabulous Welshman called Jimmy Devoy. And he's just one of a number of fishy folk that we've lost in the last 12 months. And of course, with COVID, it stands to reason that many of you watching may have lost someone close as well over the last year. So permit me, please, to toast not just the memory of Jimmy Devoy, who guided my wife to the fish of a lifetime, but many others as well, I'm sure, but also a moment for all those that we've lost. Now, to this evening's guest. He's enjoyed enormous success in a number of different fields, as a punk rocker, as a music biz executive, and even as a defender of the radio industry. And yet, while many of his peers might at 62, I think he is, be looking forward to enjoying the rewards of such success and maybe doing a bit more on the riverbank, a bit more fishing, Feargal Sharkey, if anything, I suspect is going to be doing a little less, because you can't pick up a newspaper or turn on the television these days without seeing your man from Derry there banging the drum for cleaner water, an ambition that should unite every one of us gathered around their computers this evening. So thank you for giving up your time, Feargal. You keeping well?
I'm doing fantastically well. Like everybody else, I think the novelty of lockdown is wearing itself thin, but no doubt we're all looking forward to the opening of the trout season. And for those of us lucky enough to possibly get in the Salmon River at some point later in the spring, has to give us all some sense of optimism right there.
Okay, now we've been flooded with questions, which is fantastic, from the audience tonight. I'm going to try and use as many as I can. There's a sort of ebb and flow I've got planned. We'll see how it goes. We're going to kick off with a real doddle from a chap called Donny Cameron, who just wants you to take us really right back to how you got into rivers, how you got into fishing, and if you can remember your first fish.
Well, I certainly can. The answer to the latter is there's a very old traditional Irish song, the opening verse of which says it's just 3 miles from Derry to the bridge at Drumahoe. And no, I'm not going to sing it. As it turns out, that bridge in Drumahoe is over a phenomenal little river called the Fohan. You can take a bus from the centre of town and be there in 20 minutes. And until quite recently, it actually had a really decent run of salmon. And I caught my first little wild brown trout at the bridge at Drumahoe with one of those Christmas specials Japanese multi-purpose bamboo rods that, if you put it this way around, it pretended that it was a 7-foot seafood rod, and put it the other way around, it was an 8-foot fly rod, on a little grey duster, fished wet fly styly downstream. And this very obliging little wild brown trout was kind enough to come up and grab my fly. Seared in my memory. I would have been 10, 11 years old.
Did you get to carry on with your fishing all the way through? I mean, when you're
obviously, when the whole kind of rock and roll thing started, rock and roll, and well, not all of what I'm about to mention, but some of what I'm about to mention, i.e. sex, drugs, and rock and roll, certainly got in the way to some extent or other for a year or two. So there was a small respite, a small vocation somewhere in the middle of it all, but not for long.
Now, a lot of people may be wondering, and I suspect I'm amongst them, which is, why now, Fergal? Why have you decided to sort of stick right above the parapet so clearly? Why now? What is it about the different conditions that have brought together to make you do it?
Well, listen, as for background and for those that have heard this story, I do apologize. I am chairman of an incredibly old fly fishing club called the Alma Magna Fishery. In fact, this year it will be our 180th anniversary. And I, for a while, served on the committee and began to hear conversations about this kind of a long-term issue about lack of flow in the river. And it transpired the club had made a complaint to the Environment Agency in the late 1990s. By this point, it's 15 years later, and this discussion's still unresolved. And as you know, Matthew, I've never been good at leaving stuff on my desk that's just not been finished. I'm tidy in many ways. And I got stuck into this thing, realized very quickly that there had been, and I'm going to say this gently, 15 years of procrastination by those of responsible for our rivers and indeed local water companies, and 15 years worth of endless meetings, discussion, endless kick samples, water vole surveys, entomology studies, main tropic rank scoring systems, which I didn't even know it existed or what it meant. But either way, 15 years worth of bavarication, which was kind of interesting because it transpired that in 2003, Thames Water and the Environment Agency jointly had hired a company called Halcro, who identified exactly what the problem was, identified what the fix was, spelt it out that the fix would take a couple of hours, and within 3 or 4 hours, the flow would be restored to the Alma Magna fishery. And here we are 15 years later, still discussing it. As you can imagine, Matthew, I've recently been described as a stroppy ex-punk rocker with a disinclination to take no for an answer. So, shall we say, prompted and given the ammunition I needed, we managed to resolve our issues quite quickly. I'm pleased to say the flows at the Alma Magna at the minute are absolutely fantastic. The river's looking stunning. It's never been in better shape. But that experience gave me an itch. And I stupidly scratched that itch. And then I came across people like Paul Jennings in the River Chess Association, and the Friends of the Mimram, and the River Bean Restoration Association, and the Friends of the Cam, and the Cam Valley Forum, and on, and any number of groups of people, decent, honest, trusting, hardworking people that for decades had been trying to have this conversation, specifically about chalk streams and the degradation and the failure environmentally of them. And they were, in some cases, 3 decades into having this discussion without resolution, without transformation, without change.
Are you saying that the tactic, and now of course we've got multitudinous water companies, but do they share tactics of essentially obstruction and delay? Is that...
It's clearly a bit far to go. Shall we just say that in my personal opinion, the water companies have learned how to play the regulators. They've become brilliant at playing the game, where they will do the minimum that's needed to keep the regulator at bay. But let's face it, we've been having this discussion for 30 years. And 30 years later, as we know from the DEFRA figures released last September, the last set of water framework directive qualifications, there is not a single river in England that meets good overall environmental health. And one of the biggest causes of that nationally, in terms of pollution, is the water industry. And one of the biggest causes of that regionally, in terms of chalk streams, is the combination of over-abstraction and water pollution. And people have been discussing this for 30 years.
I'm going to keep returning to this over the course of the hour, but right now, is it the water companies, the Environment Agency, both, or are other actors to blame as well in this picture?
Ultimately, personally speaking, I think you can make a decision for the bulk of it nationally. What you're actually looking at is political decisions about the price of water. and a failure of regulation. I have a lot of empathy for the water companies. They've played the regulators. Their job is to maximize the benefit and return to their shareholders. And they've done a brilliant job at it. Good luck to them, my applause. But for me, sitting behind all of this is ultimately political decisions about the price of water. And as we now know, a complete and utter failure of the regulators to safeguard these rivers.
I'm going to return to the price of water in just a sec, but it's quite interesting that today, by happy coincidence, in The Guardian, it's announced that there's a new campaign group, River Action, of which you are very much on board. And it was just quite interesting that the first target, as far as at least as the Guardian report goes, is a food company. I mean, it's a giant agri-food company, but it's nevertheless a company. And having talked about water companies and the Environment Agency, I just thought it was interesting that your first target is River Action should be a business.
Well, clearly that's based on the absolutely drastic state that the River Wye has gotten itself into. And again, it is the perfect example of there is shared responsibility between Environment Agency and Natural Resources Wales, and the regulators have clearly, utterly failed to protect and safeguard that river. It is, as a lot of us know, qualifies and safeguarded as a SAC, a special area of conservation, the one of, if not the highest form of environmental legal protection this country has to offer. And I, like everybody else, saw those photographs from last summer of mile after mile of the River Wye being turned into a green sludge. Well, at what point? So I know I put it on Twitter this morning, but I meant it. If the regulator's not going to deal with this, then somebody's going to have to. And the regulators proved themselves single-handedly incapable of dealing with this. And the source of it is, well, clearly it's to do with practice and industrial practice in and around the Wye catchment, and there's no bigger proponent than that, than Noble Foods. So let's start there. Why talk to the organ grinder or the monkey when you can talk to the organ grinder?
It's a really interesting tactic because we're seeing similar ploys being operated in different areas, totally away from what we're talking about at the moment. I'm going to return to many of the things you just mentioned, but just out of curiosity, you walked miles and miles of lost and forgotten and hidden rivers and waterways 18 months or so back. What did you learn? Did you learn anything from that's relevant to what we're talking about now?
Oh, listen, absolutely. In fact, to give you a hint, I bought at the beginning of that process, a brand spanking new pair of very sophisticated, high-tech walking boots, which I have now finally worn out. I've clearly put the better part of 2,500, 3,000 miles on those boots. That's how far I walked. What, for me, became part of the journey was clearly walking every tributary of the Thames within the M25 that I could find, whether signs of it exist above ground or not. And I did walk all of those that from the source to the Thames are now buried 100 years ago, but below roads and pavements. And what I was looking for was any sign or indication that there might be any bit of habitat suitable for a wild brown trout. Never mind actually see a wild brown trout, or good, God forbid, one of these mythical Thames salmon. But we all know that for millennium since the last ice age, there would have been tens of thousands of populations of wild brown trout harbouring and living in every one of those tributaries throughout London and the River Thames. There would, to my mind, would be no doubt there would have been reasonably healthy runs of salmon and sea trout coming up places like the River Brent, up to Dollisbrook, Muttonbrook, up into the tops of those tributaries to those nice clean gravels with that plentiful supply of water percolating over them. I could not find a single cent apart from one stretch of one river in South London. It's called the Wandle. And as you know, a band of happy volunteers that are equally don't have the ability to take no for an answer, that as a volunteer group have safeguarded that river for 30 years, have fought over it, looked after it, and the Wandle Trust, now the South East Rivers Trust, have done a phenomenal job. But it was utterly depressing. Walking hundreds of miles of river in London, seeing nothing but blank, void, decayed, dead habitat, barely capable of inhabiting bloodworm, and certainly nothing that looked like habitat that would be suitable for a wild brown trout.
You've mentioned wild brown trout, you mentioned salmon. It's very clear from the questions that have been coming in that trout stocking is very much in people's minds. We're going to return to the actual issue of stocking in a little while, but right now it's just quite interesting. It's a question from Tobias Costello, who should be watching now, and it made me think, because we've talked about many of the bad guys already, industry and the failure of regulation and the water companies working around the regulation. But Tobias points out, he asks them, first of all, how does the EA permit more than 60 tons of farmed trout to be put in the river test alone? But this is where he got me, Tobias. He said, as anglers, do we not need to put our own house in order before we start targeting others who damage the environment? Which was an ouch sort of moment for me.
As you've indicated, and here for me is the thing that sits behind the whole discussion. What about actually having the simple ambition where we can get all of our rivers to healthy enough a state that not just one of them might reach good overall environmental health, but every river in the country be good overall health, and every chalk stream be rated high environmental status? And is that the drive and the focus? Because if we've learned at the Animal Magna, if you can create the habitat, the biodiversity will follow, and the trout will follow, and the invertebrates will follow, and you will create a whole ecosystem. And with a bit of luck, you might find yourself in a few years' time going, why were we stocking trout again?
I'm going to push it a little further, that the same kind of point, this time from Michael Heaton, and he's pointing out that we're all polluters at home and at work, cleaning products, medicines, cosmetics, etc. I mean, do you not feel sometimes just a little hypocritical going after the big guys, knowing that we're all sort of micro polluters ourselves?
The simple truth of the matter is, for me, there are three prongs in this. Invariably, this whole idea. I say this with love and respect to the good people of Hertfordshire. You use more water per head than any other group of people in the whole of the United Kingdom. And it's heading up towards the wrong end of 164, 174 litres of water per head per day.
Extraordinary.
That's just shocking. Pack it in. Stop it. So there's an issue around consumer education, triggering the kind of response that people will actually act in the right way and start reducing the water usage and consumption. As we now know, Matthew, London technically last year, for the first time ever, ran out of drinking water. As we now know, the chalk streams around London have no more to give. You've used it all up. So as we speak, there are any number of people looking at how we are going to start building a national supply network to start importing water into the southeast from other parts of the United Kingdom, how to store it. So if somebody genuinely thinks we can carry on behaving the way we have been behaving in terms of our consumption and carry that on for another 30 or 50 years' time, you're really badly mistaken.
You said it a couple of times at the beginning of our conversation about the price of water, which I know you passionately believe is cheap. Now, you and I know plenty of politicians. You wouldn't want to go to an election, would you, Feargal, on the ticket that I promised to double your water bill, and not all of it going off in dividends necessarily to the shareholders. I promised to double your water bill to lead to a better environment. That's going to fail at the ballot box, is it not?
Well, listen, there's two things spring to mind. I can actually understand the sensitivity for the last 30 years. You are right. For the people listening, there's an old analogy in the world of politics, and it involves polling people in the street. Would you vote to increase your taxes if it pays and is ring-fenced to give to old people, to make sure everybody can retire with a decent pension, live a dignified, decent life for the remainder of the time after the sacrifice and commitment they've made for the first 65 years of their lives? And without question, at a poll, everybody will go, absolutely yes, no difficulty, make it a tenner a week, whatever you want. Of course, when it comes to standing at a ballot box, putting that X next to somebody's name, No way in hell on earth are they going to vote for you. You're the guy who told them you were going to put up their income tax. So there is this dilemma. But let me remind you of the statement I just made. It's over. 25 million people in the south and the southeast of England are now running out of water. The National Audit Office now predict that by 2050, London and the southeast is going to be facing a deficit of 1.2 billion litres of water per day. London is now on a list of one of the 10 cities in the world most likely to run out of drinking water, along with the likes of Cape Town, Jakarta, Sao Paulo, Mexico City. How the hell did that happen? Well, we know because for 30 years, nobody was prepared to grapple with that big political question. But now they're going to have to. And I would reverse it if I could for politicians. Minister, how are you going to explain to the people of Lancashire that there's a £50 a year subsidy on their water bill to pay for the infrastructure you should have built in the last 30 years to make sure London's kept supplied with water? I'm sure the people of Lancashire would like an answer.
I've never asked you this. I had a bit of research before we came on. It's about £400 a year is an average water bill.
Yeah.
So you're saying it should be about 800?
I used to live in Los Angeles.
Go on.
It's in the middle of a desert. For some reason, somebody built a city there for 25 million people. My water bill was about 1,200 quid a year. How does your water bill compare to your gas and electricity bill, even here in the UK?
Fraction of it. It's a third of it.
The truth is, and again, I'm using the word political with both a capital P and a small p. My personal belief is that consistently within Ofwat itself, there was a ambition and a drive to minimize the price of water and the impact on the consumer. And that's setting aside the political ideology we just touched upon. I'll give you a very simple example. It's now an old policy, but I was intrigued when I found out about it. For some years, Ofwat ran a policy which was known by the acronym of SEL, Sustainable Economic Levels of Leakage. The upshot of which was, so long as it was cheaper and therefore less impactful on water bills, to keep abstracting water from the chalk streams and damaging the environment rather than fix the leaky pipes, then that's what was going to happen because that was going to be the cheaper option. SEL, Sustainable Economic Levels of Leakage.
Don Stubbs has asked, what's the best alternative to water abstraction?
Well, listen, right now, as we now know, in fact, I'm not sure the Environment Agency quite kind of appreciated what they did last week. They issued yet another consultation. And I'm afraid, everybody, it's one of those consultations. I'm going to tell you, you're going to have to go and look at it and respond. And it's looking at water-stressed areas and designating areas like Cambridgeshire and London as water-stressed. However, buried in Annex 3 of this report, they've actually put a list of water company by water company and by exactly how much abstraction is going to need to be reduced to safeguard the future for our chalk streams, and on a water company by water company basis. And it makes really fascinating reading. So the simple truth of the matter is, if your name is Affinity Water, right now you should be breaking out into a really cold sweat, promptly followed by Thames Water, Anglia Water, Southern Water, Portsmouth Water. In a bit, I'll dig it out. I have it on my laptop here and let you see it. So the truth is, this shortage and deficit that the National Audit Office are predicting we're facing of 1.2 billion litres of water by 2050, that's not coming from the chalk streams. They've got no more to give. You've had it all. There is no more water left in the southeast. So suddenly you're now going to have to start looking at building pipelines into Wales and into Northern England and possibly Scotland, and building desalination plants and building reservoirs. And in response to that, DEFRA, the Environment Agency, Ofwat, and the Drinking Water Inspectorate have set up a company called Rapid. And Rapid has been charged with, for the first time, looking at developing a national system to secure water supply for London and the southeast.
Interesting note here from Michael Heaton, who I think I mentioned earlier, and he's saying water companies sought permission some 20 years ago to raise the price of water. and it was Ofwat to cover the cost of nitrate pollution, and it was Ofwat that refused that permission.
That's not the first time I've heard that story. And
Yeah.
in fact, conversations I've had are to be believed. That's actually also a conversation that's taken place over the last couple of years with the same outcome. But
Okay.
let me just say something here in response to that too. Water companies, whilst Ofwat may reach a final determination of what a water company will be allowed to charge their customers, water companies also have an appeals process. They can appeal Ofwat's judgment to the Competition and Markets Authority. When was the last time the water companies felt they were being hard done by with their environmental commitments by Ofwat and appealed that judgment? The answer, never, not once.
Tangential, Tarquin Millington Drake is quite right to say that very few people get to spend any time on chalk streams. In fact, if I was to ask in my local pub if it was able to reopen, people they'd have no idea what I was talking about. How do you get people to care about something they don't even know exists?
Well, you see, here's the thing. It's part of the process where the dysfunctionality comes into it all. It's sitting in the middle of this price thing is also this piece of research that's done called willingness to pay, where water companies go out and will poll people about their willingness to pay for fixing leaks, fixing the environment, and all kinds of other stuff. And when it comes to rivers, consumers are asked these text-based, completely bland, opaque questions like, would you be prepared to have a small increase in your bill to facilitate greater flows in river-stressed areas of the country? Now, to the man on the street, what the hell does any of that mean? So guess what? No.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. If I were to explain to you that there are actually about 10 times more coral reefs on the planet than there are chalk streams, if I was to tell you that there's actually about 10 times more great pandas on the planet than there are chalk streams, if I was to tell you that there's about 100 times more tigers on the planet than there are chalk streams, and indeed 200 times more blue whales on the planet than there are chalk streams, they are rare, unique habitats that cannot be replicated. They lose them, they're gone. Would you now be prepared to pay an extra £1 a week on your bill to safeguard these incredibly rare habitats? Guess what the answer is from the polls? They go off the scale absolutely without question. It's a classic case of damned lies and statistics. And I've watched people endlessly go, oh, but the numbers say this is going to be too big, too expensive. And invariably, I just go, show me the numbers, show me the model. And at that point, invariably, Matthew, I'm greeted with a room full of people staring very hard at their notepads, desperately trying not to make eye contact.
Let's talk about regulation
or lack of.
With the UK, I guess, still undergoing its domestic Brexit transition, albeit that I guess I've been overshadowed of late by coronavirus. I think we all know that there are lots of changes to be anticipated.
Yeah.
The Environment Bill, of course, has been having a somewhat bouncy ride at the government's own hands. I'd say there's never been a more critical time for interested groups and NGOs, etc., to lobby at Parliament. I still see opportunities for salmon and trout conservation, but I do also see that we're competing with a myriad of other worthy causes. Do you think we are being heard? Are we cutting through at all?
The short answer is the environment lobby is nowhere near as effective as it thinks it is, or indeed as it needs to be. And I am probably now going to sound quite brutal.
Go on.
And I apologize. Well, the last reading of the bill back at the end of January, whenever it was for me the perfect example. There were 15 amendments tabled for the Environment Bill, and government rejected every single one of them. And it's been that way through the whole process. And indeed, government then bounced the bill down the road for another 6 months. So the thing is right now, and I am going to put this out there, and if people disagree, I'm very happy to invite them into the conversation. The Environment Bill, as it stands, does nothing but provide a gateway to allow government to roll back environmental standards in the United Kingdom. And I did speak to some people.
They are, in the interest of balance, I mean, they have been at pains to stress that they're going to do the absolute opposite, that breaking truth in the European Union gives them an opportunity to set world-class standards.
Absolutely. Well, funnily enough, I'll give you one example. And again, it's possibly a reflection. Well, it'll be a pause for some people to pause and think. We do have a thing called the Water Framework Directive. The ambition was originally that by 2015, every river in England would reach good overall environmental health. Well, that didn't happen. So you can apply for extension to 2021, but that didn't happen. So you can apply for extension to 2027. And here we are in 2020, and we all know perfectly well the chance of any river in this country reaching good overall environmental health by 2027 is pretty remote. But actually it doesn't matter because it's irrelevant. Because in 2015, the British government quietly began lobbying the other member states in Europe and came up with a way to totally circumnavigate and bypass the 2027 deadline. So the reality is the Water Framework Directive, for all intents and purposes, is now dead. And for those that are listening to this, watching this, Google as I'm speaking, government's 25-year plan for the environment. Look at the section on water. 75% of water bodies to be in a natural state, there's no definition of that, as soon as is practicable. So we've now gone from 100% of water bodies in good overall status. We all know what that means. It's defined in the legislation and the regulations by 2027 to now 75% of water bodies in a natural state. We don't know what that is, as soon as is practicable. Now tell me again about government's commitment to the environment. And all of that happened in a complete sleight of hand, and nobody from the environment lobby seemed to even know what was going on.
Something else that people may not know very much about, which I still don't know myself whether they are good or bad, are the enforcement undertakings. This is a sort of a new form of civil action, unique, as I understand it, to the EA, where businesses, I think it's just exclusive to businesses who pollute and make a mess, are legally obliged to put that mess right. And having seen some appalling pollution in the Lug Mono system at the end of last year, one wonders whether that may be a way out of these troubles.
It's a cop-out.
Yeah.
It's a regulatory cop-out. It is lazy. It's lacks ambition. And it's simply another indication that the Environment Agency has neither the drive, ambition, resources, infrastructure, or willingness to actually pursue these things properly. And I'll give you a very simple example. As you may recall, the last occasion that I can think of when they did it, Thames Water ended up being fined 20 million quid for dumping 1.3 billion litres of sewage into the River Tame and thence into the River Thames. If you really want to change behaviour, you're going to have to take a very different route, and simply getting a company to agree to make a charitable donation of 10,000 quid to a local conservation group isn't going to do it, because then it simply becomes a cost of business. That's the much cheaper, easier alternative. And if you really want to affect behavioral change, you're going to have to start doing a very different direct approach. In my own experience as a regulator, I always had a big belief in this thing called light touch regulation, which effectively said, here are the rules. And in the modern world, the rules we have agreed together. We've consulted, we've held meetings. There are the rules. Now stick to the rules, and you need never speak to your regulator ever again. You break those rules, you will discover the regulator has got a very big stick and is quite happy and prepared to use it.
Alex Gibson, I should just give him a nod. He was the one that suggested or wanted to know about enforcement undertakings, and I suggest you may very well have a similar view. A few people have noted both before and during this evening that there seems to be a sort of systemic lack of flow of money into the environment agencies. The money in the water industry disappears off to the shareholders.
Yep.
The Environment Agency is starved. And in fact, you know, we did a parliamentary thing a few years back, and I did come out, I came out feeling quite, frankly, I felt quite sorry for the EA guy, because he just looked like he was there just to take a kicking from government. That was his job, to be rolled up there to carry the can for all the sins.
Listen, I say this, and I want to go to lengths to say this. When I talk about the Environment Agency, I am not referring to people that all of us would run into standing in riverbanks, standing in rivers, wearing dry suits, taking samples, doing the work. Because without exception, my own experience, they're incredibly decent people trying really hard to do the right thing. I have, however, developed the impression, to use an old analogy, that they are now in effect lions being led by donkeys. I get that the EA's funding has been massively cut back, and that's been going on for 10 years in one stage or another. But here is the thing, Matthew. The board and senior management of the Environment Agency, they are not some 8-year-old child that's just had their pay weekly allowance docked by 50p by their parents. It is their job as the board and the senior management to make the argument with DEFRA, to make the argument with the Treasury, to make the argument with number 10 that the environment is worth protecting, it is worth saving. And if any board has got one priority and one job, it is to ensure the organization has got the resource and funding it needs to go out and deliver on the ambition and the targets and job it's been set. And as we now know, our Environment Agency has become totally dysfunctional as a regulator. And for me, the responsibility of that lies directly at the feet of the board and the senior management.
Jonathan Corley asked, what single change would you make to create an effective regulator? I mean, taking the lead from that, you'd start chopping at the top.
Oh dear, well listen, me right now, the board of the Environment Agency's got to go. That's as simple as that. They are just as dysfunctional as the organization itself.
I mean, it's worth saying, I mean, just following on Twitter, that the comments that are going across, and they just do not respond. And when you're going to James Bevan at the very top, and you think, you know, a high-profile individual such as yourself, you know, Vice President of Salmon Trout Conservation UK, firing relevant questions in, and he just ignores them, or you get this dreadful statement that they've been pumping out.
Water quality has never been so good since the Industrial Revolution. In terms of, if you start with a dysfunctional board, you invariably will end up with a dysfunctional senior management. And suddenly you've just crippled the whole organization.
Listen, as they're not here to defend themselves, we'll leave that there. I think point made. And I know, well, I'm rather hoping that in future Untangled talks, as I said earlier, that we can debate single controversies in depth, with good humour, of course. It's clear, though, from the viewers' questions, that there's a couple of issues that just simply won't go away this evening. And let's do a couple of them now. Salmon farming. Now, there's another problem that I can't believe we're still fighting into this. But Will Gault asked, when will UK salmon farms blamed for so many negative effects on wild Atlantic salmon? Will they ever? Do you think they'll ever move inland as they're now doing in Norway?
Yes, and again, to me, nothing is impossible. And if somebody says no, for me, it was always simply a case of, I just asked the wrong way. So if somebody tells me, no, I'm not going to be allowed to do something, I'd just go in, completely replan and refocus my efforts on what I want to do. It was my fault. I hadn't pitched it properly. I hadn't developed the right strategy. I didn't have the right plan. So for me, will salmon farms still be sitting off the west coast of Scotland, polluting mile after mile of what should be pristine seabed in the North Atlantic, and having the devastating impact it's having on a species that we may actually be adding to a list very shortly, along with pandas and tigers and elephants, called the North Atlantic salmon? That's not going to happen. So the truth is, for me, the short answer is it's already over. So we now have a journey we can go on, guys. You can take the hard route, in which case everybody will up the ante. We will start pointing at and targeting the companies behind those farms, and the investors, and the pension funds, and indeed the finance companies that put the money up. And I guarantee you, when I go and read a large multinational fund that I could name, but I won't for the sake of it, but who oversee £280 billion worth of assets. And when I read their annual report and they scream at me about how green and cuddly and soft and friendly they are, well, good for you. can you now explain to me why your investment is now polluting a rather large swathe of the North Atlantic seaboard and putting a species of fish right on the endangered species list and causing a massive impact on the environment around the west coast of Scotland? So it's over. So shall we just behave like grown-ups and facilitate that change as quickly and as orderly as we possibly can? Because guess what? I, for one, would be allowed to sit there with a lovely piece of smoked salmon. I would be at the front of that queue the day that happens.
Let me move on to, we might come back to Salmon Farming. Let's move on to an issue that I thought Salmon and Trout Conservation UK might be a bit softer on this than colleagues I know elsewhere in the charity world. Beavers. So Guy Fell, Brian Sennett, Rob Stoker, just a few of the names that raised the issue of Mr. Beaver.
Yep.
Is the reintroduction of an extinct species like beaver good news or bad for rivers, their inhabitants, and the wider environment? I think the main concern, if I was reading between the lines, is that I think a lot of people are very happy to see beavers introduced. The fact there doesn't seem to be any end to the introduction program, that it's sort of infinite, that does seem to trouble people.
Yeah, I have to raise my hand here. I have been having a number of conversations with James Wallace from the Beavers Trust and with Ben Goldsmith, who's been quite enthusiastic about the whole thing. And there is a conversation and a dialogue going on. And I think you are right. It's one of those things that there may be places where that'll work and some places where it might not. But I clearly decided that in some areas of the West Country, it's already too late. They're out there, they're here, they've arrived. So can we possibly all sit down and agree a way forward where everybody can walk out of the room with a big smile on their face, feeling happy and content about the future? So it is important that we get all of those concerns out there right now and discuss them and work our way around them and see if we can find a way to facilitate or not. Right now, there's an awful lot of unanswered questions.
I wished I'd thought of this myself, and this comes from Barry Wilkes, and it's about beavers and salmon. And it just got me thinking. He asked, why saving the precarious Atlantic salmon seems to get less attention in the media than efforts to reintroduce a long extinct species? And I mean, Barry tries shy mentioning one, but it does seem weird that we're sort of sitting on our hands, broadly speaking, as a society, watching salmon disappear. While a great number of people, I don't know, but I'm guessing the majority of people are loving the reintroduction of beavers. It seems to be absolutely back to front.
Listen, there is an awful lot of contradiction involved out there. And again, I'm not saying this to be provocative, but it's for me one of the areas where I would suggest to some in the environment lobby how they want to reevaluate what they've been doing and how they've been working for the last 30 years. And how we've ended up with that kind of dichotomy, that we have the North Atlantic salmon that left its own devices another 20, 30 years, 50 years outside. So there's an enormous conversation to be had out there, Matthew. And some of it clearly has worked, some of it clearly hasn't. And yes, I totally applaud the very contradiction you've highlighted. And particularly when we move down into chalk streams again, but the salmon rivers in the southern England on the test and stuff. And I'm reliably informed that not only are they North Atlantic salmon, but because of their own unique ecology, they are actually their own unique subspecies of North Atlantic salmon. And we're about to wipe out whole subsections of the environment. It's incredible.
Is it? I mean, it's always easy blame the media, but it's just, it's people that, ordinary people that don't have a vested interest can grasp the notion, I suppose, that beavers are cute and cuddly and salmon are fish, which sort of somehow I often find it, and again, it's been said many times today in questions, the frustration people feel, our viewers feel that their interests aren't reflected often enough in the mainstream nature program. I do wonder whether that's at play.
Well, listen, you have a even more extensive hands-on knowledge and experience and career in the media industry than I have. And invariably you go back to the idea and notion of communication, and particularly the modern world we live in. But it's not by modern technology, it's always existed. Do you have the gift, and it is a gift, to take a big, complicated subject and condense it down into a single paragraph of no more than 12 words of no more than 3 syllables each. Because people have busy lives and people have always had busy lives. I've known journalists who have worked at both the Times and on something like The Sun. And without exception, they all say the biggest challenge as a journalist is working in a tabloid, because you have to take any subject, no matter how big it is, and deliver it in that thing. To give you an example, combined sewage overflows, the whole thing, polluting rivers, all of that stuff. You're right. If I sit and have a conversation with the man in the street about all the gory background and detail of that, they've lost it. They're asleep within 2 minutes and have wandered off to do something more interesting. However, if I simply go, in the last 30 years, water companies have paid over £60 billion in dividends to their shareholders whilst filling our rivers full of shit. Haven't I got your attention?
The clean rivers, Ilkley is one I know that you and I both paid attention to.
Yeah.
That seems to, I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it? I mean, sewage has been flowing into our main rivers forever, all the way through the Olympics, which you've drawn attention to before. I made a film about how wonderful it was going to be, how it was going to be cleaned up. And then, of course, that bit of the legacy was never delivered. Why? And I guess it kind of aligns with you sticking your head above the parapet. The timing, fighting for water, seems to have coincided with these different interest groups fighting for clean water. The sewage thing, that really does seem to have cut through in the last 12 months.
Well, listen, I would need to, at this point, give credit to any number of people, including a chip shop owner up in Whitby, who years ago began this fight all by himself and took it to the European Commission and persuaded the European Commission to take the UK government to court in 2012. So again, when people talk about it's too big and it's too complicated, there is a man called Robert Latimer who owns a chip shop up in Whitburn, up in the northeast, who single-handedly managed to persuade the European Commission to take the UK government to the European Court of Justice. All hail that kind of endeavour. And the European Court of Justice ruled that what was going on was illegal. It's in breach of the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive. The court did say that it would allow it under certain circumstances. Or, no, hold on. Or what the court specifically said, it should not happen except in exceptional circumstances.
What's the definition of an exceptional circumstance for us water company dumping sewage?
Good question. But we now know, thanks to Richard Benyon as minister in 2013, following the judgment, as the minister telling water companies he wanted all of these overflows fitted with meters and monitoring equipment by 2020. Well, here we are, it's 2020, and maybe they haven't quite kept up in quite the way Richard. But the data that we've already got, we now know that in 2019, water companies spent over 1.5 million hours dumping sewage into rivers in England. How in God's name, by any stretch of the imagination, can you define that as exceptional circumstances? Well, you can't. It's nowhere close to it. And suddenly we're back to the Environment Agency again. Down, you were told this was illegal. You've got the ruling. Get out there and do your job. But instead, the Environment Agency work with the water industry and conjure up this document. Your viewers and listeners can Google this. Simply Google Storm Overflow Assessment Agreement. And you will be shocked that 6 years after being told by the European Court of Justice it was illegal, my own personal opinion, somebody maybe was going out of the way to try and facilitate what had been happening and to allow it to continue a bit further. And that brings me to the Clean Ilkley campaign. And again, just to give people faith and hope, there was just a group of concerned, incredibly diligent, decent local people that pulled off one of the most brilliant campaigns I've seen. And the idea of applying, now it didn't start out, I think, as bathing water. I'm fairly certain it didn't. They just discovered that there was sewage going into the river and they wanted it stopped. And everybody prevaricated. We're not listening. We're not going to respond to it. We're just going to run you around in circles. And whoever came up with the idea and the strategy of applying for bathing water status for the first river in England, in Ilkley, you know what? I get on my knees and I praise before you. That was such a brilliant, brilliant thing to do. I only wish I'd have thought of it myself.
Do you think that, and I know in theory, not everybody that's a member of Salmon and Trout Conservation UK would necessarily be an angler, but do you think as an angler that gets in the way, that that there's too much self-interest perhaps?
But in terms of angling, we do in the modern world we're moving into. The public are becoming more accountable, and the public are clearly demanding more. So I think as anglers, we do need to constantly keep in the back of our minds. Yeah, when there was the last time that any of us left a bit of tippet lying on a riverbank? Pack it in. It's not good. Stop it. But I still will find flies hanging off trees. So we do have to, up our own game. But personally speaking, it's one of the things I've always liked about salmon and trout. And personally, most salmon fishers I know, I would give up salmon fishing for the next 20 years if I thought it would lead to being a healthy run of salmon again in British rivers the way that there was. I would happily make that sacrifice because ultimately the conservation and the preservation is much more important than simply my enjoyment for a couple of hours while standing in the River Tweed.
Okay, that's a big statement. Let's have a few quick questions for you. Favorite river in the UK?
Well, I'm clearly going to have to say the Amel Magna.
River Lee. If it wasn't your home stretch, where would it be?
Ironically enough, I was going to say I spent during my youth and my formative teenage years, I spent an awful lot of time in Donegal, in the Gaelta, and there's a little river there, and I'm now giving up. I'm not going to say this, and I now know there's going to be plane loads of people.
We can't travel.
It's lifted. There'll be loads of people heading to Donegal. There's a little river there called the Crawley River. You get a membership, I think, for the whole season's about €50 or something. And it's got a fairly short run of salmon, gristle, but it's a beautiful little river. And for not an awful lot of money, and I've had some really, really wonderful times standing out Paddy Oaks, which is the local pub. It's Irish for young paddies. I've lots of family connections there, so I know those people incredibly well. There's a little waterfall about 300 feet away from the pub. There's a man known locally for years, passed away recently in the local village called Crawley. Was known locally as John the Bridge, for no other reason than John's house was next to the bridge. And I used to look forward where eventually I would get these phone calls sometime kind of late May, early June, and it would be John going, the rain stopped and there's fish in the estuary, which invariably was code for whatever you think you're doing in that big important desk of yours in London, Feargal, you're about to cancel the next 3 days and get in a plane.
What about, by contrast, and I imagine you've seen some pretty terrible rivers in the UK, well, which is the worst that you remember from your walks?
Ironically enough, the one that we mentioned, and it is probably has a reputation, and probably is the most polluted river in England, is the River Lee inside the M25. It's a shocking thing. And I understand the history of it. I have researched it. I know of exactly what's been going on there for at least 800 years that are documented. But that river inside, apart from, funnily enough, the bit as we around the Olympic Stadium, where they spent a shocking amount of money, but the River Lee running through East London is in a shocking state. And in terms of pollution, it's just off the scale. And in fact, I was personally quite alarmed where at the end of the first lockdown last year, when it was getting into that really good spell of good weather, and people were clearly desperate to be allowed out. And there were occasions, you'll find the videos on the internet of people out in the River Lee and Hackney marshes, and you were talking of hundreds of people at the same time swimming in that river. There's a shocking failure of regulation right there, because somebody should have been down there explaining to those people and educating those people what they were about to go and do.
Fishing alone or in company?
Well, you already know the answer to that one.
Very trivial.
Shall we say there's nothing better with sitting at the Alma Magna with a dozen members and guests sitting around those picnic tables and a 3-hour lunch ensues. And with a bit of luck, there might have been a bit of fishing done either side of that, but probably more fishing before lunch than after it. But on the same occasion, Matthew, I've not done it for a few years now, but I did go through a long spell of over the winter poring over old maps and things like Google Earth and all over the world, and looking up old records where people taking Loch Leven trout to the remote corners of the world and stocking them. So by way of example, the last time I did that, a few years ago now, was about 8,000 feet up the Rocky Mountains in the Tuolumne Valley, which is where they discovered gold that triggered the California gold rush. And I was up there for 2 things, me and a guide. There were occasions he would have to stand in the riverbank with the shotgun, because I've never learned to run really well wearing waders. There was 2 things. One, clearly there's trout up there that I've never ever seen anything that looks like an artificial fly. And secondly, there's also landlocked salmon up there. When they built the Hurdy-Gurdy Reservoir in 1930s, they supply water to San Francisco. The Tuolumne River got dammed up. The salmon got trapped behind it, so they will swim into the reservoir, feed in the reservoir, and still run up into the Yosemite Park and up into the Sierra Nevada mountains to spawn up in the tributaries during the winter.
Does size matter?
No, no, no. Without getting into the world of innuendo, it's what you do. More important.
How do you feel when you blank?
To be honest, Matthew, I've gone through all of that stage in my life. I genuinely right now can go home feeling content just having been out on a riverbank. I can go home feeling content. And it's happened a number of times at the Alma Magna, where, in fact, Neil Patterson wrote an article about it for Fly Time magazine just before Christmas, where Neil was experiencing it. Particularly in the late summer, the trout will lock on to these minuscule little flies. And we are talking kind of size 26. Now, personally, I think it's immoral to use a size 26, because I think you have to give the trout a bit of a kind of go, that if you hook it, you need something to get it in quickly enough and get it off without damaging the poor thing. So there's days I've emptied the contents of my dry fly box over those trout that will sit there feeding. And I go home going, you know what, Feargal, your presentation, you didn't put them down, it's okay, but by God, you didn't catch a single fish. And I will still drive home beaming ear to ear, having the most wonderful, satisfying experience.
So let's go back to stocking if we can, because I would say it was the number one issue.
Yeah.
Neil Owens is one that asked, he said, how can stocking still be permitted when there is now sort of growing piles of evidence that doing so is detrimental to wild populations? I think you've got evidence back to 1974. Well,
listen, just to kind of separate here, in terms of fertile stocking, that actually was made illegal 4 or 5 years ago. So even if you are stocking, you should not be stocking fertile trout in England. It is now illegal for the very reason you talked about. I'll give you, if you bear with me for a second. As it turns out, the wild brown trout at the Alma, we did have them DNA tested. I spent some time talking to 2 incredibly wonderful scientists in Exeter University who've devoted their adult lives to trying to create, if you like, identify A, where brown trout came from, and B, identify that gene in a brown trout that suddenly gets turned on, that it randomly decides it wants to behave like a salmon and swim off down a river and off into the North Atlantic. And as it turns out, the wild brown trout at the Alma Magna still harbor DNA traces to the original brown trout that swam down the Rhine, across Doggerland and up the Thames 8,000 years ago. Is that worth protecting? Because if you have any interest in conservation and ecology, the answer is absolutely. So at that point, you ban stocking fertile trout. So I think there's a good argument there to be had around this idea of the purity of the wild fish. In terms of
competition for food and lies.
So for me, it is, I understand why people do it. And I understand why it's got to where it is. And I understand that if somebody's paying 350 quid to stand on the bank of a chalk stream, they probably want to catch some fish. But I would urge everybody to think very carefully about what's going on. Because again, whilst those things are topical, to me, there's a bigger conversation to be had right now. And that's back to how great would it be if our rivers were in such fantastic condition and we had populations of wild fish that were so plentiful and so vigorous and so widespread that we didn't have to think about stocking another fish ever. That for me is the bigger ambition to have and the bigger target we have to succeed at.
Okay, two last questions to sort of round off with, and they're both from the people watching. It's a sort of rough and the smooth. I'm going to go with the smooth. This is from a chap called Michael Swinnerton, and maybe he's been inspired by your recent cameo on Whitehouse and Morton We Go Fishing. But he asked, "What's the most spiritual experience or moment of joy you've had while angling?"
Well, actually, Paul and I did discuss it, but it ended up on the cutting room floor for some reason. I don't know why. When I really first managed to nail a spay cast with a shooting head. And I can remember standing there and just going, "Sharky, how the hell did you just..." I'd been flailing away for weeks and months, and suddenly it just came together, and this thing just went sailing 60 yards down that way, and you just go, "What the hell just happened there?" And of course, it was a feat I couldn't then repeat for several years after that. But there you go.
Oh, that's a great answer. Now I'm going to round off, and it's something of a stinger, the question, but I'm hoping we can turn it into a bit of positivity, because it's been an absolutely fantastic evening so far. So Edward Catton Orr says,
yeah,
bluntly, "I've lost faith in salmon and trout conservation UK. Tell me how you're going to change it, Feargal."
You say, ironically enough, that's what part of the conversation this morning was all about, in terms of river action, where there clearly has been a failure of regulation. There clearly is a vacuum there in terms of being able to affect change at high enough and with enough resourcing to affect that change and deliver it, and not end up sitting in a endless cycle of low-level meetings in Whitehall. As let's face it, there's been enough of that for the last 30 years. We at River Action will, over the next few weeks and days, be reaching out, and I can probably share with people there is a very positive, constructive conversation going on with salmon and trout conservation, and we would like them very much to be involved in that process and to help us with it.
On that note, some people may feel or fear that this is the militant punk rocker that's leading the charge. That it's perhaps a little too confrontational for their taste. What would you say to that?
Well, listen, by the way, the person that's leading the charge on this one is actually Charles Watson, not me. So that kind of kills off that idea from the start. It's kind of that thing you kind of now invite me to sort of start blowing smoke about myself, Matthew, and I really kind of pull away from that. I've stood in enough stages and had enough applause over my lifetime for several lifetimes. But since you're asking the question, in other guises in my life, I have hands-on directly been responsible for 4 acts of parliament here in the UK and 2 European directives at a national level. Effectively, clinically, successfully, joyfully, sometimes pushed, sometimes pulled, sometimes worked in collaboration with, sometimes provide some further encouragement. But either way, if somebody were to ask me about a private member's bill to do with sewage, I could recant at extraordinary length how myself and some others spent 8 years working with Lord Clement Jones on a thing that is the Live Music Act 2012, which started out life as a private member's bill in the House of Lords. Will that do for my CV for the moment?
I think that will do. That will do nicely. Feargal Sharkey, it's been lovely, lovely talking to you as per. And I think it's quite tangible, the sort of dynamism that's around you, and very exciting times. Everything to play for.
Oh, it
And
is.
I want to have you on board.
Ironically enough, it's the thing I would hope give people hope. Everything is genuinely to play for, and that's what makes it more important that we get it right this time, because we've got one more chance at it and one once in a lifetime opportunity. Let's go for it. Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to Nick and everybody at Salmon and Trout.
Fantastic. Looking forward to doing more of these Untangled talks in the not too distant future, and I'm sure Feargal will happily do a bit of social media over the next 24 hours as well, and me as well. So thank you very much for joining us. Stay safe, stay well, and hopefully we'll see each other on a riverbank soon. Thank you.
Thank you all.